Studio Ghibli co-founder Hayao Miyazaki is well known for his love of hand-drawn animation, so it may come as a surprise to you to learn that he has actually used CGI in his movies on several occasions, and in a rather sneaky way. There's a good chance that you did not notice these CGI scenes at the time because they were specifically designed to blend in seamlessly with the cell animation traditionally used by Ghibli. In fact, the studio actually reached out to Microsoft and had them create a program that would allow them to incorporate CGI into certain scenes without anybody noticing. Ghibli first started dabbling with CGI in the mid-90s, with 1994's Pompoko and 1995's Whisper of the Heart, both incorporating some minor digital trickery. In the library scene from Pompoko, the bookshelves were created using CGI, and the flying scenes with Shizuku and the Baron in Whisper of the Heart used about 20 different computer-generated elements. However, Ghibli's first large-scale use of CGI came in 1997's Princess Mononoke, a huge hit in Japan and the film that announced Miyazaki on the international stage. The person who was in charge of the CGI scenes in Pompoko and Whisper of the Heart was drafted in to oversee a full CGI department for Princess Mononoke, a guy called Yoshinori Sugano. When Sugano was interviewed for the book The Art of Princess Mononoke, he revealed which scenes he and his team took charge of. He said, "Miyazaki first approached me to see whether I could render a monster comprising thousands of snakes with 3D CG, the demon spirit. This proved to be the biggest challenge because moving a 3D CG image inside cell animation is extremely difficult. Miyazaki's aim was to integrate CG images into cell animation organically, so we had to develop the software from scratch. We approached Microsoft in the States to develop a program that would simulate the texture of hand-painted cells and precise colour lines. This request led to the birth of cell shading, which was used extensively on Princess Mononoke. One of the most prominent CGI shots in the film comes near the beginning, when Ashitaka is being chased down by the demon-infested Boar God Nago. It was achieved with 5 digital composite layers. First, they created the background with the forest in the distance. Next, they added cell animation of the demon spirit's tread marks, and after that came the demon spirit itself. They added a brush effect to this for extra texture and shadow. The hand-drawn Ashitaka riding Yakul was then added to the scene, which became one of the most iconic in the entire film. The tendrils that wrap themselves around Ashitaka's arm as he fires off an arrow were also made using CGI. Utilizing the software developed with the help of Microsoft, Ghibli was able to input specific data relating to perspective, shading, and movement. After that, they created a wireframe rendering of the tendrils. This is a sample rendering of the 3D model using normal digital paint, and this is what the tendrils looked like after the software was used to give them a hand-drawn look. When added to the cell-animated background art, it all comes together pretty seamlessly. The scene in which San attacks Irontown was made using a similar composite technique, as was the scene in which Lady Eboshi shows Ashitaka around the forges. According to Sugano, there are around 100 shots in the film that have been enhanced with CGI in some way. It's just that most of the work is either so minimal or so well incorporated that it's nigh on impossible to notice. This was also the case for Ghibli's Oscar-winning hit Spirited Away, Miyazaki's first fully digital production. In an interview he gave for the book The Art of Spirited Away, the film's director of images, Atsushi Okui, said, "We took pains to ensure that CG did not call attention to itself in the film, so we kept the same approach we had for Princess Mononoke. CG shouldn't influence the art style. That's what makes Ghibli's approach to CG unique." The world of Spirited Away is a complex one, and they had their work cut out for them when it came to delivering on Miyazaki's vision in a way that blended with his signature aesthetic. The water-based scenes from Princess Mononoke had been particularly challenging, and there were going to be a lot of them in Spirited Away. In the end, the CG department rose to the challenge, with the film's water scenes becoming some of the most iconic in the film. For example, a lot of CGI was used for the scene in which the stink spirit arrives at the bathhouse and it's left to Chihiro to bathe it. The sludge that pours out of the spirit and down the side of the tub was created by morphing the gradation lines, which is kind of like using the blending tool in Adobe's design software Illustrator. Of course, the stink spirit turns out to be a river spirit, whose river has become so polluted that it's been transformed into this smelly, blob-like creature. The moment in which the torrent of garbage spills out of the spirit was created with CGI, as was the moment when the river spirit comes flying out of the tub. Working with a basic background provided by the art department, the CG team used the program's soft image to add several 3D layers. It's barely perceptible to the naked eye, but they added reflection elements consisting of hand-drawn highlighting and separate colour drawings. And there's also some black and white gradation elements to depict the thickness of the foam. But by far the biggest challenge was the iconic train scene, a long stretch toward the end of the film with no dialogue and some beautiful imagery. The meaning of this scene has been dissected over the years and a lot has been written about it. But what you may not know is that CGI was used in several shots, from the water outside the train to the neon signs it passes as it heads towards Zeniba's house. Perhaps the most complicated CG shot from this memorable scene is from Chihiro's point of view as she passes a small islet with a single home on it. The clouds overhead drift and the islet rotates slowly to imitate Chihiro's shifting angle of perception. The moment only lasts for a few seconds, but a lot of work went into making it. This is the original background image provided by the art department. The first thing that the CG team did was to remove the islet and to add more contours to the clouds and to the surface of the water. The islet was then pasted in as a 3D object and its reflection against the sea was added. Then, utilising the waves created by the CG team, the art department painted the water surface elements which were then composited for emphasis. It looks incredible in the finished film, but for me, there are a few other water shots that are even more impressive. In the scene where Haku returns to the bathhouse, the seawater at the base of the building looks absolutely stunning, and that is largely because of some small but effective CG additions. The shade from the structure and light reflections projected onto the surface just give the whole scene an extra layer that makes it somehow more real and more dreamlike at the same time. The same can be said of the scene in which Lin is waiting for Chihiro in a taraibune, a traditional tub-shaped Japanese boat used by fishermen. The CG team was able to make it look as though sunlight was piercing the water, and it definitely adds a sense of realism to this important moment in Chihiro's journey. Of course, no face ends up coming along with Chihiro as she makes the journey to Zeniba's place, and it goes without saying that he's one of the most iconic Ghibli characters ever, not just in Spirited Away. What you might not know is that the scene in which he turns invisible on the bridge was also created using CGI. The art department created the background first, and if you look closely, you can see that they included a subtle dark spot that would account for his shadow ahead of time. After the animators drew his body, the painting staff split it into different elements that were then processed and added to the background separately. These are just a few of the many instances of CGI usage in Spirited Away, which really saw Miyazaki leaning into the advantages of digital imagery for the first time. Another iconic scene from the beginning of the film sees Chihiro's parents transformed into pigs after stuffing their faces with the food of the spirits. This was originally drawn by hand in the traditional way, but Miyazaki wasn't happy with the final result. According to the film's digital animation supervisor, Mitsunori Katama, the plate on the top left that gets knocked over by Chihiro's dad was really bothering Miyazaki, so they mapped the plate's pattern onto a 3D object and made it blend better with the background. He said, "If we had drawn it as cell animation, the viewer would have been able to tell it was going to move before it was supposed to move." Irritated by this, Mr. Miyazaki suggested an alternative. So we came up with a kind of background animation where a part that looks like the background actually ends up moving. Katama went on to work with Miyazaki on Howl's moving castle, and he was given the biggest responsibility of all, to make Howl's castle actually move. When he was interviewed for the book The Art of Howl's Moving Castle, Katama revealed that Miyazaki drove home just how important the castle's movement was to the movie. He said, "Miyazaki explained to me before I began working on the film, the story won't work without the castle moving. The castle isn't just part of the background. It's a character, so I want you to treat it as a protagonist." He also told me, "We'll be using lots of CG in this film." The castle's exterior was rendered digitally for a number of the film's most iconic scenes, with Katama taking inspiration from the way accessories attached to a climber's backpack would dangle and bump against each other as the climber made their way up a mountain. To make the movement of the castle look natural and make it feel like a living character, it also had to have a center of rotation. He said, "I would first create the movements for the main body and then have these other parts swing out of sync with the main body of the castle. Miyazaki at first wanted to try out a castle with 10 legs. In the end, the task would have been too demanding. It turned out that 4 legs was quite effective already, so we decided on 4 legs for the castle. Some of the castle's indoor elements were also created using CGI, most notably Calcifer, Howl's resident fire demon. This was left up to Atsushi Okui, who returned as director of digital imaging. You may have noticed that Calcifer's appearance is a little different in the scene where Sophie first meets him after entering the castle, and this was actually by design according to Okui. He said, "With Calcifer, there were 3 points we had to cover for digital image processing: softening, transparency, and diffusion as a light source. I first planned on making him look more vibrant and flashy, but then we decided his image had to be congruent with the family-like atmosphere later on in the film, so we went back and toned him down a little. The dazzling features of his first appearance are left intact for impact." Altogether, 198 shots were processed by the digital animation staff for Howl's Moving Castle, which is almost double the amount of Spirited Away. Some of them you'll barely notice, like the door of Howl's castle swinging inward as Marco answers it. If you think about it, something as simple as a door opening is actually quite hard to execute with hand-drawn animation, with the animator having to make the edge of the door coming inward appear slightly thicker with each frame to create the illusion of movement. With CGI, this becomes very simple. Though in this case, the end product was actually too smooth, making the door stand out against the cel-animated background. In the end, the CG team decided to purposefully miscalculate the angles ever so slightly in order to make the motion fit in with the hand-drawn aesthetic of the surroundings. The shot with the door was achieved with a technique known as fitting, which is where the background art is modified with software to be matched with animated cells and fitted with outlines. This technique was also applied to the castle's legs, and it was again used on the cobblestones during the scene in which Heen walks alongside Sophie as she heads to Solomon's palace. Another technique seen in the film is known as path mapping, which is essentially a way to mimic a real camera shot. It allows the objects in the foreground and the background to move together, such as in the scene where Howl and Sophie escape from the blob men pursuing them down the alleyway. Another example of this technique being used can be found in the scene where Sophie enters Howl's bathroom, with the camera pulling back to reveal how filthy the place is. Probably the most important CGI technique used on Howl's Moving Castle is known as morphing, and I say that because some iconic parts of the film simply could not have been achieved without it. Morphing is when shapes are overlapped and modified, with an image basically being dissolved into the subsequent image. This technique was actually used in Princess Mononoke for the scene in which the Boar God rots away, but that was a relatively simple shot compared to the ones the CG team needed to pull off for Howl's Moving Castle. One of the most memorable scenes in the film sees Howl throwing a tantrum after Sophie messes with his products and his hair ends up turning a different colour. The distraught wizard summons the spirit of darkness, and this creates a wave-like effect that kind of resembles curved glass. To achieve this swaying motion, the CG team processed the image so that the time interval of transformation would be uneven, and it works so well for this scene. A similar approach was used for the wormhole scene, in which Sophie witnesses Howl as a child and then gets swallowed up by the ground. According to Mitsunori Kotama, Miyazaki came to him after realizing that the effect he wanted for the hole couldn't be achieved with traditional animation. He said, "Miyazaki made specific requests for this shot, like, I wanted to look like a hole suddenly torn through the background art, and it should look mysterious, like a black hole. The first version was very graceful. It looked like a thin veil splashing inside the hole. But after looking at this version, Miyazaki said, make it more violent, as if this is the point of no return. So we ended up with the current version. We had the whole morph in extreme to convey its overwhelming power. Personally, I had no idea that so much CGI had been used in Howl's Moving Castle, Spirited Away, and Princess Mononoke before picking up these art books. But I guess that's the whole point. I remember seeing Aladdin as a kid and being distracted by the obvious CGI, especially the Cave of Wonders reveal scene. This was just a few years before Ghibli started dabbling with CGI, but the way they went about it was a lot smarter than Disney. It's clear that every effort was taken to make the CG scenes match the Ghibli aesthetic, and in their more recent films, it's practically invisible. I've yet to get my hands on the art books for The Wind Rises and The Boy and the Heron, but if you enjoyed this video and you'd like me to make a similar video about those movies, then let me know below. As always, thank you so much for watching everyone, and I'll catch you in the comments. Cheerio.